Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a big pleasure to be here in the Institute of Advanced Studies of University of São Paulo. Today we have the seminar, Urban Resilience in the Water, Energy, Food, Nexus Context. This issue actually is part of a research project named Nexus, which is Resilience and Vulnerability at the Urban Nexus of Food, Water, Energy, and Environment. This is an international cooperation. It was provided by an international call involving Netherlands, UK, and Brazil. And then we have 3 research teams collaborating, which will be represented here. Oops. And then the main issue of the international call that provided this research project is in the urban sustainability issue. So we have a team from USP. I'm a coordinator of the USP team of this research project. We have from UK University of Sussex, by means of participation of social and policy research unit, SPRU, which is funded by ESRC, UK. And you have a group from Wageningen University, which is funded by NWO in Netherlands. So, to compose the group for presentations and discussions, first of all, I will introduce Bas van Vliet, Dr. Bas van Vliet, which is Associate Professor from Environmental Policy Group at the Wageningen Institute. Welcome, Dr. Bas. Nice to see you here with us. And then Dr. Halitza Hiteva from SPRU, and a member of University of Sussex Energy Group and leader of Infrastructure Group. So please have seated with us, Dr. Halitza. Welcome here. Professor Pedro Roberto Jacob, which is full professor at the Institute of Energy and Environment, University of São Paulo. He's also leader of actually coordinator of Environmental and Society Research Group here in the Institute of Advanced Studies. And also Pedro is president of the board of ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, South America. So those 3 guys are our invited to provide speech, but I also invite here to be with us Dr. Patience Miguni, which is a research fellow also in University of Wageningen, to be here for further discussion of the ideas. So first of all, I invite Dr. Bas van Vliet to start his speech up to 20 minutes.
My name is Bas van Vliet, and together with Patience Miguni, we do this research with a case study in Kampala, Uganda. I'm going to tell a bit more about wider issues than Kampala, Uganda only. And I prepared something to tell you about resilience building practices at the urban water, energy, food nexus. We are from Wageningen University, Environmental Policy Group, and I'm leading the subgroup of urban environmental infrastructures. We are social scientists dealing with water, energy, waste, and transport infrastructures. So what I would like to talk about is about informal urban settlements, where this project is about, and some people see it as an ongoing urban disaster, and whether that should also is a need for solutions that could be called emergency solutions. So I'm going to address that question. Go into the difference between inclusions versus classical resilience thinking. Then I talk about the urban water, energy, food nexus, resilient building practices, and vulnerabilities and resilience building practices in Kampala, where maybe patients can step in, and some results and implications for governing the nexus in informal settlements. So this is a picture actually I took yesterday, or the day before yesterday, here in, Guarulhos. So these pictures, and of course you can make them all over the world. So this is Sao Paulo and this is Kampala. And some people see these informal settlements as, well, something that is temporary and that is it's called a disaster and it's ongoing. But in fact, these places are not temporary. The people live there and they are there to stay. So something needs to happen. So not only emergency solutions are necessary, like relocation or so, but think about solutions that really help people and are co-created by the people themselves. This is a table I borrowed from Astrid Ley, which I found very inspirational, to show you the difference between what could be inclusion measures and what could be called traditional resilience measures. Inclusion means upgrading, access to strategic land, participation, empowerment, comprehensive understanding of community risks, and asking yourself what infrastructures are needed for people in these areas, rather than classical resilience thinking. System thinking is about relocation, safe periphery, pressure for quick results, and what infrastructure is affected rather than what infrastructure is needed. So I think we can still keep talking about resilience, but then from another perspective, not only from a systematic perspective, but from a perspective from the bottom up. And that is why we combine that also with thinking about the urban water, energy, and food nexus. Well, also in the nexus thinking, there's a lot of thinking from a systemic level, like this. An environmental policy paradigm centered on cross-scale, cross-sectoral analysis of mutual vulnerability between water, energy, and food, as well as potentials for distributed emergent benefits or synergies thereof. That is talking about different sectors and whether you can make cross-scale connections. That's a kind of a bottom-up perspective. And another perspective would be more locally grounded abstractions of the nexus. They emphasize other dimensions of the resource use beyond security or access, such as availability, access, distribution, and utilization of water, energy, food, and environmental resources. Again, I think our project is more of the second kind here. Well, the rationales behind nexus thinking is, a first quote is from Lohan et al., and that is a kind of an SDS perspective, a science technology perspective, that thinking of artifacts like stoves or latrines or gardens, things that we think of as innovations, they are not just in terms of their presence or absence, so we shouldn't assess them just are they there or not, should we create them or not, but you should see them as a dynamic, power-laden social material artifacts that are part of a web of relations. And I like that quote. I've been in too many projects that is only about toilets or about stoves, and why don't people accept it? I think you need to think about these things as a web of relations, and that there are much more interdependencies around these things rather than just the things themselves. Another quote is, well, this is shamelessly self-citation. Consumers do not separately consume water, energy, and waste services. I've done a lot of research on consumers and consumption of these services, and I always was a bit puzzled by the fact that nobody sees consumers as doing things in the home, combining these things. They are either addressed as energy consumers or water consumers or sanitation consumers. Well, people do not consider themselves like that. And so people are combining these resources, so they are working on the nexus by doing it. So it is a practice around the nexus. So they combine the use of network-bound services in a range of social practices in their homes. And I think it is justifying why we should look at those practices rather than just looking to these silos. Talking about a nexus, you can do that on various levels. So we are talking water, energy, food, but you could do that on a home level, neighborhood level, city level, and you could do that on objects or information or infrastructures, and you could see them as, you could look at the nexus from user practices perspective, or combinations thereof. This is a kind of an overall picture for that. Now, our research in Kampala, as a case study, mainly executed by Patience Maguni, is about resilience building practices, and we focus on the cooking practices. In cooking, people are combining the resources of energy, water, and food in very different ways, and very smart ways. Why are we looking at social practice, or why do we take this approach? The adoption of innovation in poverty context goes far beyond availability and affordability, and perhaps we ought to reconsider the market-driven view of adoption, but instead consider their uptake of cooking resources as a fit to cultural practices. So it's not only about availability, affordability, it is how people are building into their cultural practices. What do they do while cooking, and what does it mean to people to cook? And of course, maybe this is well known as a kind of a picture of what we talk about when we talk about practices. Series of recursive, situated practices reproduced by knowledgeable and capable agents drawing upon norms, rules, and materials. The object of study is the set of competences, meanings, materials, rather than the actors themselves. So we are following the practice of cooking. And of course, we are interviewing people to talk about their practice and to show their practice. So we are not really interested in behaviors or attitudes of people themselves, but about the fate of the practice and how practices are interconnected and are transformed over time. Now, the case study in Kampala is in two informal settlements. It's called this is a nice title I got from patients, From One Meal to the Next. This is a study of household practices in the daily navigation of vulnerability at the urban nexus in Kampala. What we do is, we start at user practices at the domestic level, at the urban poor in Kampala. We talk about water, energy, food nexus and related vulnerabilities. But in the second stage, we also went into the provision of water, food, and energy. So also talk about the chain of charcoal that is being produced upcountry and transported to the town, etc., and being used and sold in the town. Well, cooking practices, they change overnight because it's the availability of resources, whether or not there is food on the market, whether or not there is money in the pocket to pay for it, whether or not there is a day job to get the money to pay for it, whether or not there is charcoal available or other resources to cook on. So there's also chipwood, there's also maybe occasional scrap wood that can be used for cooking. So every day it is a choice of making certain dishes based on the availability of all kinds of resources on that day. Patience has made these pictures of a very traditional food, which is matoke, which is made of green bananas. It's a staple food, but it's a long and complicated process to make it. It takes hours to simmer on a stove. But it is very crucial in the dish of most Ugandans. Matoke making means a lot of charcoal use, a lot of energy use, and so this is a dish that cannot be made when charcoal is not available or not affordable on a day. So other choices had to be made. These are pictures of the whole charcoal chain. We had an MSc student following this trace. So from the top left, you see how charcoal is being traded in the community, just in very small portions that people can afford in a day. You see the trucks bringing in charcoal every day. You see, and also upcountry, you see how charcoal is being produced. In many parts of this chain, there are problems at the nexus itself, because also at the production sites there are related problems with water and energy coming up in producing charcoal. So it's not only the nexus at the consumption level that we consider, but also the other knots in the silos higher up in the chain. Vulnerabilities in informal urban settlements cannot be assessed by only analyzing access to single resources. I hope that I clarified. And this practice approach to cooking in Kampala reveals, amongst others, that charcoal, for instance, is a crucial factor in cooking with a range of implications for, well, having a meal or not, or the choice of menu. People return to cooking leaves instead of beans or matoke because it's too expensive, it's not available. Taking risks in drinking unboiled water. People are very knowledgeable of the fact that the source water is not healthy and that they should boil it, but they take the risk consciously because they cannot afford, and they think, well, I need the charcoal for my food rather than for boiling my water. And also social interaction that comes with cooking. So the social interaction around the stove is something that is making social life in many communities. And if you come up just as an engineer, come up with another source like kerosene or whatever, then you have a completely different cooking style, and you are disrupting social life that is happening around cooking. What are implications? This is my last slide. What are implications for urban governance? Well, for governance, rather than thinking in silos and thinking in water or sanitation or energy or food, you need to take up a more integrative perspective, providing socio-technical mixtures rather than a kind of modern infrastructure ideal. So we need to have piped water for every region, or we need to have electricity. So you need to think in combinations of that. Facilitating and adopting the lived practices of resilience building. So daily survival strategies depend on the diversity of options to draw on: charcoal, wood chips, kerosene, source water, or piped water, or rainwater, or self-grown, or bought, or exchange food supplies. And supporting and embracing innovation from the bottom up. There are many initiatives on the ground, like briquette making as an alternative for charcoal, rainwater catchment, efficient stoves co-created by people themselves, and many urban agriculture initiatives that you could support. We produce all kinds of dissemination in blogs on the website of the project, and of course you can contact us about it. And we are happy to answer your questions also about our field studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vaz. A very objective presentation. We have a good time for discussion. So now I invite Dr. Halitza for presentation. Changing chairs. Okay. Well, just an important advertisement. We are with a live transmission in the website of Institute of Advanced Studies. And we will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the session of discussions. But it's necessary that the questions are done by the microphone because we are recording. It's also important to remark that the video produced and photos of this section will be available in the website of Institute of Advanced Studies within 10 days. And for the online public, it's possible to send some messages or some questions through our email, earesponde@usp.br. I have to speak in Portuguese because the name is in Portuguese, okay? Hali, please. Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to thank actually Pedro and Leandro and the whole team for inviting me to be part of this panel. For me, it's very exciting to actually share some of the fieldwork experiences from Sofia because it's unlike the Kampala and the Sao Paulo case. So in this presentation, I'm going to build on, really go deep into the social practices that we studied in the Sofia case. And the reason why my title is Urban Resilience in a Nexus Policy Vacuum is because Nexus issues are not recognized at national, municipal, or any other kind of administrative level. So the two social practices that I studied in Bulgaria over the past year and a half are urban gardening and making zemlina. I'll explain what do they mean. The reason why I selected them is because pretty much everyone does them to smaller or larger extent. And as a matter of fact, when we did our kind of practitioners workshop in March in Sofia, if you remember, I asked people in the room, so how many of you actually make zemlina? And pretty much everybody in the room raised their hands, including the 4 interpreters. So when we have these kind of disjuncture, we have this reality, a lot of people doing urban gardening in one form or another, a lot of people are engaged in the social practice of making zemlina, but it's not something which is recognized on any administrative level. So what's the implication of that disjuncture for urban resilience? One of the first things I did when I started looking at the Sofia case study is I did a mapping exercise of vulnerabilities that existed in the way food, water, and energy were provided within the city. For those of you who don't know, Sofia is the capital city of Bulgaria, and it has about 1.2 million people. So it turns out that there are big system issues in the provisioning of all 3 resources. First of all, there was a certain unevenness on it, of the provisioning, the kind of stuff that you wouldn't expect to find in a country which is a member state of the European Union, and it's part of Europe. This unevenness will be expressed in things like the hot water supplied for district heating plants will be either scalding hot, so people have to dilute it by running cold water, or it's going to be lukewarm. In other times, it will be brine, it will be yellow. I identified 5 different shades of yellow, it could be. The electricity that was provided in some areas in Sofia, including the city center, you would have huge variations in the voltage. So a lot of people will suffer from their laptops blowing up, their TVs blowing up, their fridges short-circuiting. And you had to buy this adapter thing, which I kept seeing in all the people's homes that I went to study them. And it turns out that this is what basically normalizes the currency. And it's the same with food. There was also a big issue around the lack of transparency in how food, water, and energy were provisioned. For example, in terms of food security, everybody was really concerned about what was in the food that was being sold in the supermarkets. When food was being purchased from individual small-scale suppliers, there were huge concerns about whether there were any GMO, whether it actually came from, and it was grown on land which have suffered from high degrees of pollution. In the provisioning of particularly energy, for example, and water, there was a significant lack of choice. That is that people, for example, living in the city center were stuck in housing that absolutely had to be district heating. And it was really, really hard for an individual in one of these big multi-family buildings, which have anything between 11 and 45 families living in them, to untangle oneself. For one household to say, I do not wish to be supplied by the district heating company was almost impossible. Even those who decided to switch off their radiators still had to pay a flat rate charge because of the heat that was coming through the pipes, and it didn't matter that their radiators were not working. So this is in terms of lack of choice. There is a huge complexity in the way people had to pay for their water and for their energy, particularly for hot water, for cold water. Let's just say that in many cases, people not only didn't understand how the price that they paid was calculated, but they didn't also have physically access to the meters. So they couldn't, there was very little they could do in order to protest against the price or to make a claim that they didn't spend as much as it was told. But most importantly, if they needed to make vital decisions, particularly in the winter when it was really cold, when they had to make decisions about how do they save on hot water and heat, it was really hard for them to do so because they had to rely on their own personal estimates. And it didn't quite work out, usually. So, of course, that led, generally speaking, to huge issues of affordability. Sadly, Bulgaria, as a EU member state, actually has the highest levels of fuel poverty in the European Union, which goes anything, depending on the estimates and how they're done, can vary between 40 to 60%. So that means that, if we exclude vulnerable groups such as pensioners, people with disabilities, single parents, then what you have is that people that have good middle-class jobs could actually hover and suffer from what you call seasonal vulnerability because they just wouldn't be able to either pay fully for the energy services that they need during the winter months, which could be anything between 4 and 5 months, or they would have to actually make trade-offs between what kind of food they purchase, where they purchase it from, where they put the heating on, how much hot water use, and so on. And these are all Nexus issues. But the biggest kind of system problem of all is that most of the kind of the utility companies and policymakers at national and municipal level that I had to go and talk to had to first explain to them what the Nexus issue was. There was absolutely no recognition that the way, what Bas talked about, that even as users, the way in which we use water, energy, services, and food in our homes was in any way related. As far as the government, whether local or national, was concerned, as long as you produce food but you don't sell it and it's for personal consumption, you're free to do whatever you want. You can grow it in any way you want. As long as you pay your bills, you're free to, pretty much burn anything. And as a matter of fact, when I was doing the second leg of my fieldwork in Sofia in January this year, when I landed in Sofia on the 6th of January, you couldn't see higher than 2 meters because the city was covered in very heavy smog. And this didn't used to happen before. This is a new thing. People actually struggled to keep warm in minus 10 to minus 15, that they would burn wood into apartment buildings which have, 40, 60 apartments with no ventilation. Some people would burn old clothes because that was cheaper than switching on a radiator. So the biggest issue was that not only regulation and administrative arrangements didn't recognize that the way in which food, water, and energy were provisioned and used were related, but there was also no recognition that there could be anything that could be done thinking across these individual silos. So I call this Nexus Blindness, and that's why I talk about a Nexus policy vacuum. The good thing is, though, is that the Nexus clearly plays a big role in how people cope with these systemic problems. Then the vulnerabilities that I found is that big vulnerability was worsening air pollution, increased emissions released in the atmosphere, water not suitable or pleasant to drink, deprivation of energy and water services, either on a seasonal or just all year round. And also I found that for a lot of the families that suffered from these vulnerabilities, access to food, good quality food, and particularly fresh food in the winter months was a serious issue. So, very briefly, as you probably know, anyone who has looked at resilience will know that there are different definitions of resilience. In trying to figure out how am I going to identify resilience, I wanted to turn to something quite simple. Usually resilience stories and narratives are about how systems or cities as whole systems of things that interact respond to particular systemic problems and individual vulnerabilities. But the one thing that I found very useful is to think of it as what kind of mechanisms of self-organization do we see in the social practices that we study They show us that there is a capacity to learn from the experience, your own and that of others, to, in a way, process information about the relationship between the food, water, and energy provisioning, and to adapt accordingly. So I here will think that if I talk about resilience, I will talk about the individual level and the level of certain communities to be able to do exactly that, to self-organize. And I will say that the social practice is one of the most simple, basic, and common forms in which self-organization takes place. So what did I encounter? And the two social practices that I studied, one is probably the most unfamiliar one. It's making zimnina, which is essentially, zimnina is a term in the Bulgarian language, and direct translation means food for the winter. And it's a very broad category. It could include anything from tomato paste, called lutenica, to whole jars full of full tomatoes, few cucumbers. So this would be food that includes jams that you can use for breakfast. It would also include whole meals that you can just warm up. It could also be the basis of a meal to which you either have to just add fish, meat, or rice. And so it's a very broad category, and of course involves a lot of different ways in which the food is prepared, and it's consumed in the winter. The most common way of making zimnina actually is big glass jars with metal caps. You put whatever you want in them, you boil it, you wait for it to to get to a high enough temperature so that the metal top clicks and sinks in. It's something that you have to listen for. You have to listen for the pop. And then you know that it's good for the next 4 or 5 months. Urban gardening, also quite controversial. I would say that I came up at the end with my own definition of what urban gardening is, and this was informed by what I saw in Sofia. So for me, that encompasses any gardening activities carried out within a city, within the periphery of the city or outside the city. But if it's carried outside of the city, it has to have a functional relationship to the city itself. For example, it could depend on a flow of resources from the city and vice versa. And the other important element is that the distinction that I made between urban gardening and agriculture was that if we talk about agriculture, usually there is an element of selling what you've produced that you don't need to consume yourself. In the case of gardening, I found that whatever you produce is used for non-commercial purposes. You either use it yourself or you pass it on to friends, family, and others. So I looked at urban gardening and making zimnina as the two social practices which people used regularly in order to kind of build up their own resilience, to deal with these structural issues and vulnerability that I spoke about earlier. So the good thing about urban gardening and making zimnina is that they're, in their essence, they're nexus practices. I mean, you can say this about pretty much any social practice, but I have to say that the way in which zimnina is made is extremely energy intensive, usually involves more than 2 types of energy. It will be wood, gas, and electricity, and the most common form. It's very water intensive. There is a lot of cleaning that's involved, a lot of boiling that's involved. And of course, I found that very often whatever is produced for urban gardening is then made into zimnina. So this is a quote from one of the people I shadowed for several weeks in Sofia, and I think it's a very telling quote. This is an 86-year-old woman who basically lives with her disabled son. She has a small garden in the periphery of the city. Otherwise, she lives just bang in the middle of the city center. And she basically moves to live in a little shack in that garden for 5 or 6 months in the year in order to be able to grow and prepare a lot of zimnina then through which then her and her son are able to survive the winter. One of the most telling thing about this, I don't know whether you're using this time to actually read the quote, is that the way in which she prepares the zimnina is so that one jar is equal to 3 meals a day for her. And I can show you the jar. This is the jar. On the first day when I visited her, she showed me, I came around 10:30 in the morning, and she showed me the jar. So this jar right here includes slices of green peppers and aubergines with the seasoning added to it. So she's already had breakfast. She's basically had 2 slices of toast, and she's put, a green pepper and an aubergine on top, and that's what she's had, with a bit of tea. So she proceeded to explain that she prepares the zimnina in a way in which allows her to put everything in, and then the breakfast usually be cold with the toast, then she'll heat it up for lunch, and then she'll heat it up again for dinner. And in the way in which she actually talks about it, in the process for which she uses this, it becomes quite clear that, for example, she needs to prepare this whole jar in this way because she wants to use minimum type of energy in order to be able to consume it. So, for example, the reason why the whole day meal is in one jar is because she switches off her fridge in order to save electricity, and also that she doesn't need to add anything to it, prepare it. She also talks about the fact that she needs to sterilize the jars really well. It means that she washes everything that's involved in the practice of making zimnina, and that then she has to use open fire in order to ensure that the temperature is high enough for this jar to be properly sterilized so it can last until March, which probably will be the time that she will need it by. And as you see at the end, she says that she has to do this because otherwise she can't manage the heating bills. So this is a photograph from the basement of another of the participants. This is what zimnina looks like. This is what 4.5 to 5 months worth of food looks like. We're talking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 2 people. And the reason why I took a photograph of this is because, if you remember when I was talking about the vulnerabilities, is that for a lot of the quite vulnerable people that live in Sofia, the only access to fresh fruit is whatever they can actually pick from the garden at the end of the summer and keep kind of cold for as long as possible. I mean, this was taken in January, and you can see that they're already not as fresh as you wouldn't buy this in the store. What you cannot see here, but all of my colleagues saw in Sofia, is this quite interesting photograph of a big box of potatoes that were kept right next to a loo. Do you remember that? In terms of, how do you store things? Yeah. So I want to spend a bit more time talking about making zimnina. As I said, it's very water intensive, energy intensive, and the best thing about it is that it doesn't really fit the urban landscape very well. Making zimnina traditionally was carried out in rural areas. But as a result of socioeconomic changes in Bulgaria, starting from the 1940s onward, a lot of the rural population was moved to the big cities. So what we see, for example, this thing here with the DIY gas burner for red peppers, for zimnina, this, for example, happened within the city center. I mean, this is the entrance of a big kind of building where about 20 families live, and it's within a 2-minute walk from the Parliament, the House of Parliament. So the lady had just basically put a metal sheet, opened the door, and she was making zemlina right there and then. As I said, a lot of people are dedicated to using coal, wood, and gas because it gives a specific flavor to the food. So what you see is a lot of other makeshift ways in which you can do this in an urban environment. So the second smaller photograph, this is taken in one of the large streets where cars will be passing and buses will be passing and people will be walking on the pavement. So the reason why I wanted to highlight this is not only to say that these practices have to be significantly adopted and transformed in order to fit the urban environment, but in a way they also create other nexus aggravations. So for example, with the way in which the peppers are roasted on the DIY metal thing, I mean, it releases a lot of air pollution in the area. I will leave this there, so if anybody wants to write it down, they can do so, and just wrap up. What I find really amazing about these two social practices is that it's quite clear that they travel quite far. Not only in the way in which kind of urban gardening takes place, and then it's how the produce is brought into the city, transformed. But then a lot of the zemlina which is made travels quite far between people. So people actually give each other and exchange jars with zemlina all the time. That for me means that these social practices that a lot of people already are doing, actually the implications of how they're done are much wider than of an individual person making 200 or 300 jars every summer. They have huge implications for the wider environment, whether we're talking about air pollution, on how water and energy is used, or how a space is used. And it's mind-boggling that a system that already has such a range of issues doesn't recognize the compounded effects of the way in which food, water, energy are provided and consumed. That means that urban resilience, if we want to talk about urban resilience at the city level or community level, there is, first of all, we have to recognize the importance of these insignificant practices to which the administration and the rule of law is actually blind. They think that these are types of hobbies that people do. They're not. As the story, the narrative of urban gardening and making zemlina actually illustrates is that there are ways in which people actually survive for many months in the city and how they're able to continue to live in the city. So I think if we're going to talk about urban resilience, the best thing we can point out is that these practices are related and the effects that they have travel quite far within the city and maybe outside of it. Thank you.
So nice. Thank you, Halitza. And before inviting Pedro, it's relevant to remark that Pedro has worked with us in the research team since the beginning of the project in 2015. But as a member of the ICLEI, we invited him also to talk about the ICLEI views about this idea, these proposals linked to the Nexus. Please, Pedro, give us your speech.
There's only one slide. Yeah. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm very pleased to be sharing this conversation with my friends and colleagues of Sussex, Wageningen, and our team in USP. First, to explain you a little bit, ICLEI, Local Government for Sustainability, is a coalition of municipalities worldwide. It is in all continents. It was created in the beginning of the 1990s, and basically it aggregates municipalities that are focused on sustainable initiatives, sustainable actions, sustainable programs. It's important, I'm showing this first image, and I'm the chair of the board of ICLEI South America, which aggregates several countries where ICLEI is collaborating directly with municipalities. We could say that basically ICLEI's role is on capacity building in formulating together with municipalities initiatives that are within the wide range of actions towards sustainability. And I just arrived from a last week World Congress of ICLEI that took place in Montreal. And the reason I'm showing this slide is because this is a new vision of ICLEI from 2018 to the future. This Congress reunited more than 900 people in Montreal from more than 200 cities worldwide in all continents. And in South America, we were represented by cities in Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru, in Argentina. And this is probably one of the first times that this vision is being shown. And what is important is to observe that it has everything to do with what we are talking, the nexus thinking, because it, as pillars of this 2018 to 2024 strategic vision, there are 5 interconnected pathways in order to transform urban systems. So we are talking about the low emission development to reduce climate change, create new economic opportunities, and improve people's health and natural systems. The second is the nature-based development, protecting and enhancing biodiversity and ecosystems within and around our cities that sustain the major aspects of our local economies and on which we depend on for the well-being and resilience of our communities. The third one is circular development, which I believe has a lot to do with our project, not this new agenda that encourages new production and consumption models that meet the development needs of the global population and allows the construction of sustainable societies using recyclable, shareable, and regenerative resources, and thus extinguishing the linear model of produce, consume, discard. The fourth pillar is resilient development to anticipate, prevent, absorb, and recover from shocks, especially those caused by rapid technological, social, and demographic changes, aiming at improving essential response structures and functions. And the fifth is equitable and people-centered development, building fairer, more livable, and inclusive urban communities and tackling poverty. These visions are clearly a new approach, which is much more intersectorial. Before that, ICLEI was much more on themes. And this opens very much the dialogue for something that is essential when we talk about the nexus, that is intersectoriality, collaborative action between cities and its stakeholders and its communities. So this way, it's important to see that ICLEI's role, and myself, I feel very comfortable to say this, is the possibility of sharing innovation and creativity with municipalities. Many municipalities may will to do some things, but they don't have technical staff to develop these programs. So these programs, by ICLEI's articulations between cities opens a very important door to innovation, to sharing experiences, and basically to capacity building of the technical teams in municipalities. Today, there are more than 2,500 cities that somehow have been receiving collaboration from ICLEI's 22 offices worldwide. And it's important to say this, it is basically a coalition of cities that engage in a program, in the programs of ICLEI. And in every country there are offices where the technical support is essential to establish a dialogue with the cities that are somehow interested and associated to ICLEI. The former president of ICLEI was the mayor of Seoul, and now the new president of ICLEI is the mayor of Bonn in Germany. And before the Seoul mayor, it was the Vancouver mayor. So it's always the president is a mayor chosen by a committee that represents the whole system of mayors that are responsible of choosing the president. I want to stress that these initiatives that I will be talking now that are being implemented in South America, but also in other continents, and some projects are exactly a dialogue between South American experiences, African experiences, and Southeast Asian experiences, basically. And these initiatives, they are talking about the integration of water, energy, and food supply in different contexts in which they are inserted. So this one project that I'm talking now is called the Interact Bio Project, and all informations about it are on the site of ICLEI. It is a 4-year project designed to improve the use and management of natural resources in fast-growing cities and their surrounding regions, aiming to provide urban population with expansion of something that is becoming more and more disseminated, the idea of nature-based solutions and the impact that these nature-based solutions are essential when we talk about ecosystemic services, for example, which is also something, an issue that is being more and more multiplied worldwide. This will allow governments at different levels, from local to national, to join their efforts to integrate biodiversity and ecosystem services into key subnational government assignments, such as land use planning, land use management, local economic development, infrastructure projects. For each metropolitan region in which it is implemented in Brazil, the city regions are the metropolitan region of Campinas, which is 80 kilometers from São Paulo, the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais, and the metropolitan region of Londrina in Paraná. And they were cities that participated in a bidding process, so they were chosen because they assumed that they would have the technical support and the engagement of the municipal team. And in these cities, there was mapped the challenges for the preservation of biodiversity, and where or are being mapped the ecosystem services provided by local environmental resources. So this project, Interact Bio, which is also being developed, as I mentioned, in other fast-growing cities in Africa and also in Southeast Asia, it brings up a new discussion, which is part of what we are talking here on the Nexus, no? And the dialogue that we are establishing, and the challenge to promote more social inclusion, promote as possible jobs, and obviously a better quality of life, as we are called, equitable and people-centered development on nature-based development. So when we talk about the cases of Interact Bio in the city of Campinas, this is based on the definition of connectivity area prepared jointly and in a participatory manner by the municipalities of the metropolitan region of Campinas. This connectivity area is based on the concepts of multifunctionality and guides the use and more sustainable occupation of the territory through solutions based on nature. And it foresees the connection between conservation units, conservation of priority areas for water supply, conservation and recovery of relevant forest fragments, considering the interference of the highways that cut the metropolitan region of Campinas, the implementation of green areas of social function, such as parks, and the creation of green infrastructure to deal with climatic events, heavy rains, drought, landslides, heat waves, fires, etc. So these initiative aims to promote the integration of biodiversity at the regional level based on the premises of the National Program for Connectivity of Landscapes, CONNECTA, established in March 2018 by the Ministry of Environment. And it is important to stress that the concept of connectivity area should bring multidimensional perspective to the connectivity of the landscape. It's not limited to the concept of ecological corridors, since other connectivity devices and strategies can more fully meet the requirements of connectivity assurance in order to involve communities and their interaction within the site. The multidimensional perspective brings a more integrated view of the territory and of different flows, such as biological, human, water, diseases, climate information, knowledge, among others. Therefore, it contemplates the social, economic, and environmental dynamics in the planning of these areas, enabling a greater involvement of the municipality of this metropolitan region. And it is designed to promote more sustainable regional development by fostering nature conservation, maintaining ecological processes, and economic and cultural social prosperity, and increasing resilience to climate change. It will connect ecologically relevant areas, maintaining or restoring landscape connectivity, and facilitating genetic flow among populations. And it will also promote alternatives for the adoption of low-impact land use and land use practices, incentives to the green economy, but also connect people through nature-based solutions and urban infrastructure such as linear parks and greenways. It's important to stress that it is a very, it's an initiative that obviously depends a lot on the approval of the municipality, and also in terms of how relevant intersectorial actions can be developed. No? It's also, as I mentioned, that for the refinement of the connectivity area and definition of connectivity guarantee strategies in each section of the same printed maps that were circulated between each municipality. The metropolitan region of Campinas has more than 25 municipalities involved. So this implies in something that is definitely new, a connectivity area map, adjusting it within the limits of the respective municipal territories from the existing regulations on land use and occupations and their compatibility with other connective strategies, such as linear parks, established ecological corridors, existing and protected natural fragments, and areas where wildlife is relieved. And also, in order to evaluate and emphasize the importance of the benefits of implementing the connectivity area in the metropolitan region, there has been taking place a mapping workshops on ecosystem services that was moderated by ICLEI and the Forest Institute of the State of São Paulo. This proposal and its guidelines will be forwarded for consolidation within the Integrated Urban Development Plan of Metropolitan Regions of Campinas, and thus the municipalities will be able to define the main lines of action for the implementation of the area and possible mechanisms of inter-federative environmental compensation. And this has to do with something that is absolutely new in terms of implementation in Brazil, that is the Metropolis Statute, which is a law 1389 of January 12, 2015. And it's beginning to be discussed in many metropolitan regions in Brazil. Obviously, things don't go as quick as we would like, no? And all these debates on the metropolitan statutes have been taking a much longer time. In the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte, the following strategic objectives were defined to promote the connectivity of existing conservation units in the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte by means of recovery and degraded areas located mainly in areas of metropolitan interest, which is also a new type of definitions of social interest for the metropolitan area, associating with a network suggested by the blue-green infrastructure to support the development of a platform of promotion of agro-ecological and biodiversity initiative at the metropolitan level that can make online data available and support the strengthening of a participatory guarantee system, Agro-Ecological Certification. During the fourth national meeting of agroecology, this took place between May 31st and June 3rd of this year, that took place in Belo Horizonte, was signed the Protocol of Institutional Cooperation in favor of strengthening agroecology in the metropolitan region and the surroundings of Belo Horizonte. And this event was part of the call for the recognition of local governance as key players in building sustainable food systems, which not only ensure food security for the population, but provide decent livelihood opportunities for producers, processors, and traders in rural, peri-urban, and urban areas, but also promote environmentally viable forms of food production. Thus, the signing of the protocol established an important step towards promoting an integrated vision between food security policies and recovery strategies for degraded areas. I think this is very interesting to look up in terms of our project, the idea that you can establish a protocol between municipalities in a metropolitan region that are really engaged in food security and biodiversity. And Belo Horizonte is also part of the City Food Platform, a platform led by ICLEI and the foundation RUF, which has accelerated actions by local and regional governments to develop sustainable and resilient urban regional food systems, combining networking with training, guidance in food policies, and technical expertise. Through this initiative, it will be possible to map innovative projects to promote food security around the world and to promote the exchange of experiences between local governments, both in relation to strategies of governance and mobilization of actors and in confronting traditional practices of food cultivation that lead degradation of ecosystems. The proposal is to strengthen these regions to overcome barriers in the implementation of sustainable food systems, such as deficit of management capacity, deficit and data analysis, political and interest conflicts, as well as challenges for metropolitan integration. And finally, the Connecting Nature project in turn addresses the theme of nature-based solution within the scope of cooperation between Brazil and the European Union. The initiative will co-develop strategy, policies and practices needed to increase urban resilience, innovation and governance through nature-based solutions under the leadership of 11 European cities. The project brings together municipal governments, small and medium-sized enterprises, academia and civil society to generate practical and useful knowledge to make cities more sustainable. In this context, the Connecting Nature Academy, to be launched in July 2018, will offer Brazilian cities a platform to express their needs and share experiences with European cities on planning and implementing nature-based solutions to generate new jobs, foster growth, and strengthen their resilience. Thus, Connecting Nature is located in the pillar of development based on nature, addressing interdisciplinary issues of water, energy, and food. I think that this agenda indicates the connection between an organization like ICLEI and the work that we have been developing in this project and in other projects based on the Nexus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Now it's time to start some comments about the exposition. So first of all, I would like to invite patients to start. Would you like to bring some first comments? Or
yeah,
please.
Thank you very much to the three presenters for the very knowledgeable work and words that you've given us. And very interesting experiences too, from Sofia, Kampala, and more from a sort of more general overview from ICLEI with Pedro. I think from the three conversations, one of the things that I get here is that they are sort of initiatives that happen sort of on a bottom-up level, on a day-to-day that people take part in at the Nexus in cities around the world. And in our case, Kampala, in Radi's case, Bulgaria. But then there are also initiatives towards resilience that are taking place or that are being fostered from a top-down perspective, which is more from the perspectives of ICLEI, if I understood correctly. So some of these, the Interact Bio project and the Connecting Nature project. So my question to Pedro is, do you have any knowledge or any comments on how the types of projects that you have in ICLEI connect with what users are doing on a day-to-day basis in Belo Horizonte, I think it was, and Campinas, yeah, as well.
ICLEI dialogues with municipalities. So the big challenge, obviously, of the municipality is to establish the dialogue with stakeholders. And ICLEI technician support can stimulate or always tries to stimulate this dialogue of municipalities with the communities. But this is something that is case to case to be looked, and the way that also the political culture plays a role in these cities. No? From some other experiences of ICLEI, in some cases municipalities were very open to dialogue with communities, and others did not do it as well. So ICLEI cannot overcome the barriers of the logic of municipalities, definitely. And it's something that wears the technical support of ICLEI and tries to stimulate municipalities to work on a basis that the dialogue with communities becomes stronger.
Okay. I was wondering about the relationship about this experiences in terms of research and also the ICLEI's agenda. Actually, since the beginning of the project, we had this idea to make this seminar, so this is very important for us. And also, I would consider that it's important for us to think how we can make some further contribution in terms of bringing together the ideas or the possibilities from the study and the ways in which we can make some interactions, some good interactions with ICLEI. Because, of course, ICLEI is this kind of big alliance of local governments. We are working with local vulnerabilities. So, in this sense, this question of ICLEI agenda of promoting equitable and people-centered development, I think it means something like very important for us. But not only in terms of providing social inclusion, reducing risks or vulnerabilities. One important thing that we can contribute with our study is to shed light on social practice. This is really important because society, people living in vulnerability contexts are always, every time creating solutions for those very hard situations in which they live. So this is, in my opinion, one thing which is very exciting to study, to understand not only the practices, but a diversity of processes, not only also the social practice, but the process of each social practice can be interacting with another practice, because social practices occur in like spaces of practice. They have limits and possibility to interactions with other social practice, sometimes in different levels. In the beginning of the project, we also started thinking about public policies and practitioners' works as social practices. So in the sense, as we are bringing value to bottom-up processes, and as Hali also stressed, the importance to see this process of self-organization, which can be related with more resilience scenarios. So in the sense that those bottom-up processes and social practices could make good interactions with possible better policy, public policies. So I would like to hear from you about this, how you are considering this kind of interactions among local vulnerability social practices and possible or necessary interaction with public policies.
Okay, thank you. I guess using one of the examples that I talked about, if you remember, I mentioned that fuel poverty is something that unfortunately is experienced by many people in Bulgaria. So we're talking about people who own their own home, who work. So right now, the way in which particularly vulnerable groups receive help from the government for fuel poverty through cash payments. However, there are a lot of problems that are related to that. So there is a big body of literature that deals with these issues, but if the relationships between the two practices they talk about teach us about anything, is that it's very possible to be able to design programs at municipal level which provide help for people experiencing fuel poverty, not through a top-down approach such as cash payments, but using the ways in which they already cope with the situation. So this could involve providing support for urban gardening, such as provision of more green spaces in the city that can be worked. This could also include provisions for more sustainable ways in which food can be not only grown but processed, prepared into zemnina and then stored. One of the big issues, for example, is the kind of the individual decisions and trade-offs that people have to make in preparing zemnina. So if, for example, there is a provision for creating spaces where this could be done at a community level, it could be done in a more sustainable manner, and it could mean to more food security for vulnerable groups. So what we see then is, in a way, a nexus approach to approaching fuel poverty. So the solution might not, for an energy problem, might not necessarily be an energy solution. It might be a combination between different sectors, such as food and such as the provisioning of water and energy. So I don't know to what extent organizations like ICLE are able to provide support for such initiatives, or that they even recognize such initiatives as a way forward. But I think that's an exciting policy intervention area. The main question for me is, how do you sell it to the municipality and to the local governments? Because right now in Sofia, they're completely blind to nexus issues. It's going to be a big sale.
The striking things in this project is that we compare cities and case studies, and Sofia is of course so different from Kampala, but on this level, talking about the nexus and how people are dealing with that, there are quite some similarities in looking for governance solutions. Indeed, I think also in Kampala you need not to just think of the energy provision or water provision or food provision, but sometimes the solution in terms of better diet choices or better water may be into looking into the provision of energy, namely charcoal or other sources of energy. So that is in general terms a similar kind of policy recommendations that we can make. So look at what people everywhere in the world, people are dealing with water, energy, and food because they need it. That's basic, universal things that people need. So look at what people do on the ground already and try to build up on that rather than thinking into infrastructure provision only. So those are the general terms. In general terms, an answer to that, but maybe patients can fill in more on specific level on Kampala or not?
Yes, that was exactly my question. We were in Kampala and we saw the site, how the strategies of survival, if we want to call it that way, are taking place. And I would like to hear from patients a little bit more about the different possibilities that people have, and not the word choose, but have, in terms of shifting situations between having and not having, and this implying obviously in something that is their conditions to nourish themselves. So the different types of energy, ways of using energy for their daily life.
Okay, so I think for Kampala, at least based on our project, how we decided to look at it was to say, what does it take for a meal to come together? That was the sort of simplest way of trying to see the nexus, and then tracing out the different sort of problems or weakest points within that nexus. And for energy, so the most used energy source, that's charcoal for cooking anyway. And then lighting is the electricity, if you do have a connection, or kerosene lamps. But for cooking, it is mainly charcoal. But charcoal is also getting quite expensive. So people also resort to using dead wood from the swamps, if you can find it. Like in Raleigh's case, old clothes in really desperate situations. So old clothes or something that whatever can burn, in a way. And but now there's also some evidence of people trying to make briquettes using solid waste and cassava flour or whatever binder they can find. And I think in the most extreme, you would have families that would go without for that day or for that night because they haven't had enough money to buy charcoal, or they don't actually have any other options for that day. And in some places, the vulnerability is also quite is temporal. As in Riley's case, you talked about seasonality of vulnerability. In Kampala, it's also temporal. So there are factories, for instance, furniture factories that have wood chips that households then go and harvest the wood chips and use to cook. And if that furniture factory is not working that day for some reason or other, then people don't have energy to cook with for that day. So it's all very temporal. It's all very transient. You can't really tell what will happen from one day to the next as well. I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah.
And the last, after Publica's questions, Pedro, would you think that in this ICLEI agenda would be possible more importance for social practices in the sense of those social practices that can bring some solutions in this self-organizing perspective? What do you think?
I think, yes, the problem is how. But I mean, definitely I think that there has to be, by these international coalitions, the capacity to bring up the strengths of social practices, dialoguing with municipal policies. And I believe that when ICLEI decides through its international board, to put on the variable equitable and people-centered development, I believe that there is a real possibility of the dialogue that through academia, because academia has an involvement in terms of the definition of initiatives and innovation in the proposals of functioning. So I believe that it could be possible to do that. And definitely I will try to do that in the Brazilian and South American case in terms of strengthening the need to see the importance of social practices and their adequability, I don't know if that's the exact word in English, to a dialogue between municipal practitioners, consultants, etc., that are involved in this proposal. What I think is important is that we are, from academia and international organizations, we bring up an agenda that is really very contemporary. It dialogues with ODS, no? That's important. And at the same time, the challenge for municipalities to perceive how much their policies can be more effective when intersectorial, when interdisciplinary. Obviously, as I mentioned before, the barriers and the bottlenecks are in the logics of the political culture of each country, region, state, municipality.
Okay. I would say that we are available to talk to ICLEI's board about social practices and the Nexus too, okay? So, questions from the public? Oh, you have to make in the microphone, please. Come here, Nicholas.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question for Dr. Hiteva. I found the last part of your speech that's super interesting and even more promising for new research agendas, because we all know that the food, water, and energy nexus interactions spread across vast territories, right? It's not only a local thing. But still, this is actually very difficult to measure or actually to assess it. And what you said about the inhabitants trading Zimina jars, I think that it could somehow give insights of the geographical patterns of the Nexus footprint, right? Have you thought how this information could be used for this purpose, or I don't know what is the state of art of this trading of the footprint nexus? Thank you.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. I don't think that much has been written about making zemlina. There are geographies of care through the exchange and giving of food. I would say the more interesting aspect of it, there are two. Conceptually speaking, the fact that we're talking about urban resilience. And urban gardening, in my case, proved to be something which in some cases was as far as 200 kilometers from Sofia. I mean, people that were growing about half a ton of tomatoes in the land that they had inherited, and it was really 200 kilometers away from Sofia. But they used to travel about half a week, sometimes 3 times a week, in order to kind of cater for the tomatoes. That's one. I mean, this challenges the assumption that urban gardening is something that happens predominantly within cities. Making zemlina also as a practice then provides a challenge for social practices as being kind of neatly defined within particular spatial categories. I would say conceptually, these challenges to what we consider to be urban in a spatial context and what we consider to be an urban practice, that's quite interesting. In other terms, I would say the other interesting element of the practices is how they, the transformations that happen through these practices. So if you think about making zemlina, used to be something that would be done in one place in a rural area where you have access to everything that you need, all the equipment, all the wood, all the open space, and that's where you would store it. Now people do crazy things. They go and pick their tomatoes somewhere in the city. When they bring them back to their flat, they put them through the blender. They freeze them until they wait that the price of peppers drops down. So they go and get the peppers from somewhere outside of the city. When they go to a third place in order to grill them, then they bring it back to their apartment. When everything is taken somewhere else, whether they can have access to wood, and so on. So another way in which we can think about this, not only in terms of a future research agenda, but as an intervention space, is those key spaces of transformation. Because that's where the water, the energy, and the food, that's where they come together. So I think these 3 areas are a good kind of starting point. If anyone's interested in kind of taking up the banner of making zemlina and seeing how far it can go into challenging, the way in which urban planning takes place, for example.
Question was about
More questions? Alberto? Okay. Microphone, please.
Thank you. I'm Alberto. Thanks for your presentation. So I have 2 questions. The first one is for Halitza. I'd like to understand more about the term that you mentioned as Nexus Policy. So my question is, what is Nexus Policy for you? And what do you call Nexus Policy? And the second one is for you. And I would like to hear from you comments about how can the water energy food nexus, can be feasible in a government decision that is historically based on silo thinking, for example. Thank you.
Thanks. So I would say, sadly, Nexus Policy is literally a policy which either is built around interactions between different silos, and its most simple form, for example, in urban planning or in government regulation, it happens when you have interdependencies between different types of infrastructures. So this is, however, it's a very kind of engineering and technical point of view, because the assumption there is that the way in which the interaction happens between different sectors is kind of very smooth, and it can be made smoother through, let's say, technological innovations, or by setting the right standards that allow for interactions to take place. However, what we see in practice is the Nexus Policy, what we call Nexus Policy, actually turns out to be policy which could be about one thing, such as, let's say, energy, with huge implications about other sectors, such as food and water. I mean, it's in most simple form, for example, is that we see how few poor people have to carry out certain kind of practices, such as more intensive use of water in order to ensure that they have sufficient access of food during these terms. So, say, depends how you want to look at it. It becomes even more interesting when you think about not only the impact of a single or a cross-sectoral policy in terms of the nexus, but when you think of policy which, whose objective is then a nexus objective. And what we see, particularly in cities, is a shift towards these kind of policy objectives. One example is well-being. I mean, most of my research is actually based in the UK, but what we see is that, for example, a newly built, a newly established institution called the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK, one of its primary objectives is to ensure and increase the level of well-being of people living in the UK. If you think about it, well-being is a perfect example of a kind of a nexus objective, because it's hard to achieve well-being without having a productive and sufficient balance between food, water, and energy, not only on an individual level, but in terms of how they interact within systems such as cities.
Added with some Dutch examples, I think in cities, city policies are changing rapidly, and there's much more attention in innovative cities to horizontal policy making with neighborhoods, with consumer corporations or energy corporations within the city, and they call themselves energy corporation, but they also deal with the nexus. So many of these communities are also dealing with urban agriculture or water. So facilitating these kinds of that is now coming up. Traditional municipalities are now wondering how to deal with all these initiatives, because our system is geared towards silo thinking and top down. But there are many more groups knocking on their door, so please help us. And they need to define new policies to cater for these kinds of initiatives. There's another point, I think also in infrastructure terms and in technological terms, you see now cross-cutting innovation. So there's a lot of things that combine water and energy. So there's heat recovery from water, and so also in technological terms, there are many more connections to be made. Many of the sustainability innovations are about combining these issues. So also on that level, there's a reason to integrate and to define different policies rather than just water, energy, or food. And so it's coming up.
Now talking as a researcher, not as ICLEI only, if we look at the city of São Paulo, we can see a lot of initiatives that are taking place without permission, if we want to use the word, from the municipality. So there are several initiatives developed by communities or by NGOs in terms of food security, in terms of urban gardening, because this is really not a practice that you can see. In Europe, when you travel by train, you see a lot of these places where elderly do even leisure, no, if it's not survival, no? And this is not part of the culture. Although we are a peri-urban city, there are some regions of the municipality of São Paulo, because remember, it's a very large municipality with more than 5,000 square kilometers, where there is a lot of organic agriculture taking place. So there is a real possibility of implementing stronger policies in terms of food security, in terms of protection of watersheds. But definitely when we talk about energy, the challenge is to promote more and more in the future autonomous energy, because our energy depends basically on dams. Hydroelectric comes from very far. If there is a short circuit, I don't know what's the word, if the energy cut, it can cut for 3, 4, 5, 10 million people. It depends, because it's a line that comes from the Amazon, it comes from the south of Brazil, it comes from the center of Brazil. But I think that it's important to stress and see how much initiatives are taking place, because people are committed to change ways of life. And this is not only as part of an imitational practice of middle class people, but really of the role of NGOs stimulating the more vulnerable communities also to be more autonomous and empower their activities also.
Okay. Patience, something else?
What was the second question again? Because that. All right. I think, first of all, based on what we are doing in the project, I'll just reiterate what everybody else has said, it's to find out what people are actually doing in their day-to-day lives in the particular city. So if it's urban gardening, if it is other initiatives that people are actually doing, that is one way that you can sort of try and figure out what kind of nexus interactions you should be looking at as a municipality. But I do find that even as we are right now, that things like nature-based development, to me, that is somehow taking a nexus perspective to it, because you're looking at nature as providing multiple functions, whether it is food, whether it is stormwater drainage, so all sorts of things as well. So I think we're already sort of trying to go there, but I think the best way might be to look at what's happening on the ground in reality, and then take it from there.
Okay. Yes, we had, as you have realized, we changed something in the program, but Dr. Sara Bauer is here with us. He's going to make a comment or a question, please.
I have a question, in fact, which has two parts. So the first part of that question is, I'm wondering, or rather I would like it for all speakers to recapitulate and summarize, perhaps in one point, the benefit that is gained by using the term nexus instead of interdependence between food, water, energy, and the environment, or integrated urban development. What is gained by using the term nexus? And what kind of nexus framings, so second part of the question, what kind of understandings or approaches or framings of these interdependencies would be most beneficial, you guys think, for achieving the goals of sustainability, democracy, democratization, justice, and equity in cities?
Oh, so easy. Thank you. Actually, this is a kind of existing CO question for us. We are researching the idea of nexus, so let's go. Thank you.
The answer to part 1 and 2 is 42. Yeah, a shout out to the fans of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I think is just you and me, Syrup. But it passed as well. Okay, so for me personally, the difference between what we gain by talking about Nexus is that we are opening ourselves up to a high range of ways in which the food, water, energy, and environment interact with each other. The agendas of smart cities and the idea of integration kind of makes an assumption about one type of interaction, and that is when you have two things coming together and forming as something else which works as a whole. What we see in the Nexus is, with the idea with trade-offs, for example, is that we see different types of interactions. Some of them are forms of competition, of domination, of symbiosis, of spillover, and I think being able to to understand the nuances between these trade-offs is quite useful, especially when you have to achieve certain types of objectives, such as well-being or economic growth or sustainability. Because the fact that a certain kind of trade-offs happens in a particular way doesn't mean that it's good or bad, but it just means that different types of interaction could have a very, a differentiated outcome to different goals, such as sustainability. I just genuinely don't remember the second part.
The second part was about what kind of principles do you think are likely to be most beneficial for constructing
Once they're understood, I would say, because by not only by the people whose job is to actually design policy and implement policy, but also the people, understanding how everyday users, citizens, people that we call practitioners, actually if they have an understanding of how the nexus impacts their everyday life and the role that they can actually play in affecting the interactions of the nexus. I think this kind of level of understanding is essential to bridging the gap between these social practices that we are seeing and the complete lack of, this Nexus blindness that I talked about. That's me.
Thank you for this question. To me, content-wise, I don't think that talking about interdependencies is talking about the nexus. So nexus is a label, but what we gain by using the term nexus is that we speak to an audience that is already thinking about the nexus, but then in another way. So I would like to reframe or rethink the nexus rather than just from a very systemic level, but still be in dialogue with these people and say, okay, we adopt the term nexus, but we want to look at it from another side, from the bottom up, and how you could see the nexus as being produced in practices. So it is a strategic way to discuss the nexus and nexus issues with people who are already discussing these nexus from infrastructure perspectives or from silos, etc. So it is adopting this and then turning it around. That's also how I would like to speak about resilience. It's a very systemic term, but I can adopt it and turn it around and put my perspective in it. The same goes for smart. What is smart? Well, I can make my own definition of it and then speak to these people who are talking smart cities all the time. So that is a kind of a strategic way to do it. And then, second question, that was a very difficult one. Sorry? 42. I think, while talking about the nexus in this way, from a bottom-up and from a practice perspective, I think you can, you are in the heart of talking about justice and sustainability and equity, because then we talk about how people are dealing with these resources, and then you can pinpoint where are the lacks in provision of the resources, and how are they distributed, and how uneven it is, and how you can make it more even. So it is a kind of a way to discuss these issues from that. That's maybe half an answer, but I leave it there.
I think that the word nexus stimulates the idea of a dialogical approach. And it also stimulates the idea of a relation between theory and practice. And the research project directly shows us the, say, possibilities, but also the bottlenecks to overcome, no? And in some way, some kind of transition to reduce vulnerability, inequality, when possible, but having to deal always somehow with public policies, no? But nexus for me is a good word. It's not just simply a label, because it establishes links, and links that can be seen as tangible, because when we talk about the relation between water, energy, and food, it is something tangible. It is something that people can perceive in terms of how they also can establish their strategies. No, we use the word of strategies of survival in sociology in the 80s and the 90s. Today you don't use it as much, but it was very used in literature. I don't know why it changed, because it's still tragedies of survival, no, in many cases. But anyhow, words may change, but the situation not necessarily. No. The other aspect to consider when it comes to equity, democracy, social justice, it has to do also with the way how people organize themselves on one side, and on the other side, how much public policies are open to really generate spaces where dialogues can be established to debate policies. And that can be a way of democratizing, when not directed and manipulated, obviously, and at the same time, a way of bringing a debate on inequality, on vulnerability. So it makes sense to talk all these variables that you mentioned, which are political, social, cultural, even anthropological, within the idea of the nexus.
Want to say something?
Yeah, okay. I will. Well, I think for me as an urban planner, the term sort of integrated planning is rather static, whereas the nexus implies some kind of flexibility, as you're saying, Pedro, that it can be anything for any particular, at any particular time. So you can come together around certain issues, and it is also free to come apart and engage with other issues and still continue. Whereas I feel that terms like integrated planning and all that are rather static and quite prescriptive at some point. They can become that. Whereas I think with the nexus, you have the space to engage with more substantive issues as per rising need as well. I don't remember what the second question was, actually.
The framework that can be very important for
Okay, I think Bas and Riley answered that perfectly fine. Yeah,
let me just, in addition, I really like to stress that we have to work on this and to make this idea, which is a relatively new idea, the nexus, as not only a technocratic approach. We have to work on this social things, importance in the dynamics of socio-ecological systems, exploring the nexus, and also with all the political spaces necessary to work on the nexus, as well as to bring about the social background and its relevance in terms of understanding and dealing with the nexus. So, in the sense, again, the social practice framework for me seems to be very interesting, because we are linking or relinking something that the modernity put very separately. So this is an opportunity to explore how people in the vulnerable context are dealing with their hands with the nexus, because people are really dealing with those scarcities, right? So I think this framework of social practice can be really relevant to this kind of challenge. So we have a question from internet. who sent is Lida Benitez, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Public Health. Here the question: how your studies contribute to the current debate on how to shape global and local responses to climate change by reflecting on lessons learned and best practices from cross-stakeholder and cross-sectoral engagement from Nexus approach. Okay, who's the first?
Well, I think in the case, now talking more in terms of ICLEI, the case is that ICLEI is really engaged in climate change issues. All these aspects and the former agenda of ICLEI is very linked to the idea of reducing vulnerability to face climate change. And definitely when we look at these aspects, low emission development, circular development, nature-based development, resilient development, we are talking about all the possible initiatives, practices that can be shared between public policies and civil society, no, of our country. So definitely the issue of low emissions is very linked to public policies, improving the role of public transportation. Our cities lack it very strongly. No? There is a definite gap between the need of public transportation and how public policies in most Latin American cities have been stressing the use of cars, and now cars begin to see by some segments already a little bit as a villain of the process, but still not in the level it should be. No? São Paulo is a city with more than 6 million cars, which is absolutely unbearable. No? Raise your hand, somebody who didn't be in a traffic jam today to arrive to USP, for example. No? So I mean that we have to take this into account. The role of circular development is very interesting because it opens exactly the door to discuss how to deal with solid waste that we produce, how to recycle, how to reproduce, how to reduce the volume of inputs that are part mineral, no, that are part from extraction, no, basically. And this implies also in new ways and new processes of production and consumption. No? And nature-based development, what we are talking, and it's although it may be very much used by ecologists, it's something new when it comes to public policy. No? The idea of nature-based development is something that is beginning to be stressed, and I believe that all these ideas, all these concepts and resilient development have to be more and more brought to students since their beginning of schooling age, no? Because that's the way of how people begin to establish the interaction between the different variables that take place when we are talking about the fact that we have to face climate change. No? And now IPCC is meeting now at this moment in China, and they are proposing a new agenda that will be really presented almost 2020, I believe. But they are very worried about the fact that it has to be much more people-centered than only on measurements and metrics.
Actually, my study in a way goes against the grain of a growing body of literature that looks at climate change mitigation and adaptation by the introduction of new technologies, such as particularly technical innovations around the production of energy. So the smart city agenda, for example, assumes that there is a lot of agency of consumers that will be enabled by intelligent systems. But if you look at the kind of research that I did, you actually see that a lot of people that live in the city either don't have access to these intelligent systems, or even if they do, they're on a very basic level have to do trade-offs between Are we going to eat today? Are we going to put on the heating? So, and that, on one hand, that kind of really challenges the assumption of policy that we can mitigate and adapt to climate change through introducing efficiencies and improvements in how different elements of cities come together. That's on one hand, but on the other hand, it also highlights that people have a lot of agency, particularly in how they contribute to climate change without realizing it. So, for example, a lot of my participants that were high-fiving each other about the fact that they ate a lot of clean food because they grew it 200 kilometers outside of Sofia, totally didn't take into account the fact that they had to drive 200 kilometers 2 or 3 times a week. And they were actually contributing to emissions. Yeah. So I would say that the more kind of literature we create and the more studies we do around where exactly agency lies will help us understand what kind of interactions that, how we can actually contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I actually think in a way in which we have a lot of agencies as researchers to kind of go against the grain. Sometimes it's really easy. I mean, I do a lot of work on infrastructure, so for me it was really, really a big struggle to actually try to do something as low-tech as looking at how people make zimni now and put things into jars and eat them. Because it's not sexy. I mean, do you know many tomatoes I had to peel and cut to do this, to do this research? It really isn't. Especially if you compare it with a really nice and flashy new power plant which has some kind of new technological innovation. It really isn't. But then if you want to understand how certain types of infrastructure actually work or do not work, you really have to spend like a day peeling 50 kilos of tomatoes and then washing them in a random place in the middle of nowhere. And the kind of insights you gain are priceless. So I would say that it's one way in which we can hack this climate change agenda is to go against the grain and go against our own comfort zones.
I think from the Kampala case, one of the biggest things that we found, or one of the biggest conclusions that we reached, was that whilst families can be vulnerable at the water, energy, food nexus, by the very fact that they are living in informal settlements, therefore actually disqualified from being in the city, that was where most of their vulnerabilities were based. So urban land is actually a very big part of the urban nexus because it then determines who gets access to infrastructure, who gets to use it, and who is actually excluded, and therefore who's more vulnerable at that very nexus. So that wasn't something that we thought of, we had assumed before, but it was a finding that we found particularly central to addressing everything from climate adaptation, but also reducing vulnerability at a household level as well. But it's also, I think, it also speaks to a much bigger question about how developing cities have actually developed and how they are currently governed. Because if you have a city where at least 40% of the city lives in what is considered an informal settlement, then that means you have very, very big problems. First of all, managing what you have right now, the current situation, but also planning for more resilient communities. Because if 40% of the city is not supposed to be, or is not thought of as being part of the city, what is supposed to happen to them? And I think, Bas, you referred to this as something of an ongoing, whether we can look at it as an ongoing disaster or something, or that people are looked at as being temporary citizens, and yet they are there to stay. They're not going anywhere at the rate that urbanization rates are going. So, yeah, urban land is a crucial part of the urban nexus.
Leandro, do you want to talk a little bit about Guarulhos, or shall I talk? Okay. The case of Guarulhos also indicates, and in the region where, because Guarulhos, we have to remember, is the second largest city of the state of São Paulo, and the region where the research was done is very marked by the lack of regularization of land use. So this is an important aspect to stress, and how this impacts also the issues of energy and water use, no? Because a part of the population uses strategies of survival, of taking the energy from the poles and also from the poles, and also from the tubes. But that's not the majority. But definitely the strategy of survival, basically, of the most vulnerable population. On the other side, what is important to stress is that if public policies were established for a better use of land, there could be also a larger an expansion of urban agriculture which has been seen in the case of Novo Recreio, where the research has been done. So there are spaces where these initiatives of urban agriculture could take place, and the research showed exactly the potential and the motivation that people acquired to develop this in a more communitary basis, because there are some initiatives, but they are very individual, local, as individual survival strategies. No? So definitely the issue of land has to be taken into account when we talk about the idea of the nexus, no? And to show that if the issue of energy, when looked to the future, we could see that more people in situations like those that we described here in São Paulo or in Kampala could be of population producing autonomous energy and not depending on their bills, say. But obviously there has to be a subsidy for solar or for wind, no? But definitely that's a way. And the other thing is that we didn't talk directly here, but the idea of deserts of food have to be also considered, because these areas, they are sometimes very far from larger supermarkets where food can be cheaper. In many cases in these neighborhoods, there is speculation in terms of the prices of food. So if people are able to produce more of their food, they also will have more resources to improve their quality of life instead of spending it with expensive food, for example. I don't know if you want to aggregate some ideas there.
Yes. Indeed, that idea of to look at the urban peripheries as food deserts, in which it is not easy to find fresh and healthy food. So this kind of fresh and healthy food produced near the places for consumption, this idea in our assumption is a synergy for the nexus, right? So, but many times people who live in the periphery do not have access or possibilities to have fresh food. This is a main concern in our case in Guarulhos also. Do we have any more question? Identify.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Well, my name is Cleandro and I'm a master's student at Faculty of Urban and Architecture. And I have two questions. Basically, one thing that I noticed is when we have some public policies that the government try to put into to apply, sometimes the population cannot afford to deal with these proposals, and they go back to more traditional approach. And I would like to put in a discussion this thing that we are talking about nexus between water, food, and energy, but in which extent you are talking about the nexus between science, policies, and the population? Because I think this is a very important topic as well. And another thing that is more specific for Dr. Halitza, I don't know if I pronounce your name correctly. Yeah. And it's very interesting because I think Kampala is a more similar situation that we face here in Brazil, but the situation in Sofia, the cold weather, it's very different for us. And how is the implication between people burning things in their houses to warm, to increase the temperature, affects their health in the extent of respiratory problems? Because, and also about the food, I think in the case that you showed the picture, they're not using any specific place to keep the food in a cold temperature. So I think if you are burning things in one room in your house to warm up, you are also exposing your food in another room to this increased temperature. What is the issues that you could see during your study? Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, that's how you end up with potatoes in the toilet. Really. So one of the reasons why we focused on social practices in order to look at the nexus is because we actually adopted a very different theoretical framework of looking at practices. I mean, Bas mentioned about the dominant literatures around social practices has to do with meaning, competences, and materials. And the idea is that if there is a convergence between the three, then a social practice takes place. If for some reason something changes and this convergence is broken, then the practice either transforms or it dies out. So what you tend to find is that this provides a very anthropogenic point of view. So the focus is on the practitioner as the kind of main agent through which the meanings, the competencies, and the materials are brought together. Actually, Saurabh Arora is the main initiator of it. We looked at Stenger's work, who's a philosopher of science, and we adopted a conceptual framework around ecology of practices. The beauty of it is that it provides a very different focus on who has agency in performing a particular practice. It's a much more open approach, and the focus is not on the practitioner, but on a range of heterogeneous elements or collectives that come together. So this could include actually inanimate objects, natural environment, and so on. That one, and the other thing is that in the interaction between science, policy, and technology, we, in a way, by adopting this approach, we actually give a lot more voice to the practitioners themselves in terms of how we design our vision building workshops, in terms of when we translate what actually happens in the social practice and why does it mean something to policymakers. In a way, we give a space to practitioners to speak as the kind of key experts in their practice. That's one. And the other thing is, well, sadly, I could see that a a lot of people in Sofia in January struggle with respiratory problems because of the air pollution. There are also huge environmental concerns that have to do with the industrial history of the country. So, for example, one of the community gardens where I did research was right next to a district power heating plant. And the water that was being used to water the garden essentially was linked to the wastewater disposal system of the power plant, which turns out that until 6 years ago used to run on coal. So when I applied twice to the said thermal district power plant to see its environmental impact assessment, they have to do one every month. They decline to give me the information. And this kind of information is not provided anywhere. So one big issue is that unless you are doing urban gardening on private land and you have the means to do the proper environmental test, you actually don't know what's the land that you're growing on. But at the same time, there is a very strong narrative of people believing that if they grow their own food, then they're in control of what they consume. They think that if they've not put any chemicals or pesticides in it, then it's basically organic.
I would like to say something about the approach of this project, especially the methodologies that we did, relating to your question about science and policy and community interactions. We talked about transdisciplinarity yesterday. So, the case studies that we did, and we also found out what was happening here in Guerrerios and Simone's work. It is doing research in a very qualitative and time costing method of walking along with the people, and then we call it shadowing. So we don't ask people to tell what they do and what they think, but we just let them show what they are doing. So we're doing it along. So it's a very time-consuming method, but it makes that people build trust in you as a researcher, and I speak for the field researchers here. And then you get other findings than just asking people what they think or what they did or what they normally do. So and with these projects, something happens. So in the case of Simone's project, there is now a whole school project on urban agriculture, and that is because of doing research, and it generates new initiatives. So now a whole project on urban agriculture. It's not happening in all the areas that we do research in, and also your cases that you are really peeling tomatoes, and that we had these in all the 3 cities. We had these workshops where people from the area were in interaction with the providers of services and municipality people and the researchers at the same table, which was, if you think about it, quite a unique situation that we had in all the 3 cities. So this project has been generating these kinds of interactions on a small level, but it was interesting to see how that happens.
Okay, just a short explanation, because you mentioned Simone's approach. She's working in Novo Recreio, Guarulhos, with a participatory action research approach, and she's working with the group, of course, implementing urban gardening, communitarian urban gardening there. That's it. It's a participatory process.
Yeah, I think that's important to stress, because we could have chosen another dynamic, and we chose the idea of research action as one of the ways of really creating the interactions between science, community, and the engagement, if possible, of policy. No? Because that's always an open door, but definitely it has ethnomethodological aspects, anthropological aspects, and this has been a positive way of engaging the community in a proposal that is external, because it's an engagement where the idea of promoting the nexus, at least in the short range, is the easiest, is the best way, because if we would have chosen energy, for example, probably we would be much more frustrated because of the difficulties of thinking about, maybe we would have been more theoretical than practical. And in the case of choosing gardening or choosing the urban agriculture, it's something that is more feasible in the short range.
And I also think in the case maybe of the whole project, really, what we then produce from the fieldwork are narratives of these lived experiences, which policymakers can then, instead of just surveys of, there's 1,000 people drinking from an unprotected well, or there's 1,000 people who don't have access to fresh food, they're actually seeing these experiences in written text as well, which is I think the beauty of using the social practice method, theory and methods that come with it. So I think, our project was quite performative in that sense. And maybe it also helps in sort of translating how people live into what policymakers can then try and use as well.
Okay, I think we could have time for one more question. Is there anyone else to make a question? That's okay. Also, what about final considerations? Hali would like to start. Final considerations, please.
I would personally say that although I have seen what the impact of a small number of engaged researchers could have on our community by introducing new ideas and help them understand the nexus interlinkages is, I don't think the solution is to have a researcher in every community to do exactly that. I would say that if we genuinely want to have a crack at urban resilience, then there has to be a high level of recognition of nexus issues, at least within local governments and urban planners. And I would say that a key area that transformation can start from is just providing more open spaces for, spaces of transformation, I would say, spaces that are not non-regulated, but where people can do different things. Whether it's they want to make semolina, whether they want to cut tomatoes, whether they want to grow things, but I would say spaces where people can actually do the kind of things that they need to do in order to continue to live the kind of lives that they want to, provided it's legal. So I would say that, we need more spaces for transformation rather than more researchers in every community to invigorate things. There just isn't space to do anything.
Thank you.
I want to say something completely different about this project, because we are a team put together because of, you know how it goes with these fundings, etc. And so we end up with a Brazilian case study and a case study in Kampala and Sofia. Nobody would have thought of this combination before. And I found it a very strange combination, but in the end, you see now things come together, and then it becomes very interesting. So yesterday we were talking, actually we were all talking about cooking, for instance. Even here in Guarulhos, it was about beans and cooking beans, which is a cooking practice around the nexus, which is also the case in zimlini making and matoke making in Kampala. So we found some common language and common cases of what we can study, and in which we can gain insights on how the nexus is being reproduced and make people or areas more resilient. So it is the project is coming to an end, but now finally I see why it was a good idea to work together on it. Thank you, and thank you for being here and listening all this time to us here on stage. Yeah.
Thank you, Bas.
Yes, I consider that this dialogue is essential. The learning process between us and the possibility of strengthening understandings of our specificities. This makes also that we would be able to produce science on a much more dialogical and intercultural approach. I think that is very relevant in terms of the outcomes of this project. And I want also to thank your participation here today as the chair of this group of Environment and Society, because these groups at the Institute of Advanced Studies have the freedom to prepare the agenda they want in terms of contents, in terms of debates, and this makes it a very interesting space to really be creative, innovative, provocative, heretic, democratic, and basically open for interdisciplinarity, open for possibilities of dialogues between situations that could be not imaginable in the context of our unit. So the Institute of Advanced Studies is really a space for a thinking on the present and the future with an understanding of the historical basis of our realities. Thank you very much.
All right. I think mine is slightly different. It's not so much about the project, but about what I learned from being in Kampala for many months about the city itself and how the city is run. That it's not only about an enabling environment or providing spaces of transformation, maybe from the bottom up, but it's also about having a city administration or policy practitioners and a policy framework that is also enabling in terms of experimentation with new ideas. So I found that the city of Kampala was quite good in that, and that was a very heartening thing to see. And so there is hope, even if a city like Kampala is almost half informal. The people who are actually working towards making it resilient are actually doing their best, and they're really, really trying to get either new ideas or old ideas, but trying to inject new energy into them. So, yeah, I found that quite a big lesson for me as well.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I would like to thank to everyone here because of the audience, but I have to thank also the Brazilian team on research. We have here Ana Maria Vedran Martins, which is postdoc with us, as well as Carolina Carvalho, also postdoc. Ana Maria worked a lot with the team organizing this whole week of collaborative working, and also having a really nice visual building workshop, which is very important in our methods. Alberto Urbinati, PhD student, Simone Omori, master student, and Isabella Santos, all of them from the team. Isabella is PhD student in Procan. And thank you, everyone. We had a very nice conversation. We have just registered for further interest. And I consider a very well-succeeded event. Thank you so much.